Ladies and gentlemen, this is a brew right here. This is the epitome of a brew. So I got the skeleton for this deck from my friend A-Shock, and you guys might remember him from Grand Prix New Jersey, where he made a pretty deep run with Affinity. And if you'll remember, that was a Legacy tournament. So Affinity and Legacy, not something you see every day. And he also had stuff like Contested Warzone in his deck. So pretty crazy stuff. But yeah, anytime he sends me a brew, it is generally pretty crazy. It is along these lines, and it is generally has a very good idea behind it too, so it's worth looking into, and this is certainly one of those decks. So first card right here, bang, Training Grounds. Rise of Eldrazi rare, activated abilities cost 2 less, and clearly that is pretty good with Pack Rat. So if you play turn 1 Grounds, turn 2 Pack Rat, turn 3 you have 3 black mana thanks to like an Urborg or something, you just have 4 4/4s, and that's pretty insane. That's pretty tough to deal with even in Modern. So this combo has been around for a while, but there hasn't really been another thing to use Training Grounds with until now. So we have Tasigur, and he sent me this deck like right around Pro Tour Fate Reforged. So, you know, he was working on it for potentially his friends to play in the Pro Tour and stuff, but none of them eventually made the plunge. So we have Tasigur, and you see his ability come up every once in a while on stalled board states and whatnot. But since it costs 4 mana to activate, you know, you only get to do it like once. Maybe you mill like a discard spell that you don't really want back, and then maybe you don't have time to use it again because you're so far behind. But with Training Grounds, even though we have things like Training Grounds in our deck, which are not very good in multiples considering the cards that we're playing, you know, you activate it, maybe you pick up a Training Grounds, and that's not great, but then you can activate it again multiple times. So I think Training Grounds turns Tasigur from this solid value thing into pretty much a card drawing machine if you have enough blue mana. So I thought that Training Grounds, Pack Rat, Tasigur was a shell worth investigating, and here we are. So my initial lists were, you know, blue-black, and they functioned a lot like the various green-black decks you see, where, you know, there's some discard, there's some removal spells, and it was ultimately a little bit lacking. I think the deck just like wasn't powerful enough, wasn't cohesive enough, had a lot of problems. But at the same time, I was also playing around with various Sultai decks, which had things like Stubborn Denial, Tarmogoyf, Tasigur, so I decided to just jam them all together, and that's basically what I do with a lot of decks, is like I pull one idea from 3 different spots, combine them all, and it actually ends up working out pretty well. So I have not played a single game with this deck beforehand, so I have no idea if it's actually going to work out well or not, but that's part of the excitement, right? That's why we're here. So yeah, we have Tarmogoyf, Pack Rat, Tasigur, all pretty big threats, all capable of turning on Ferocious by their own. So now we have Stubborn Denial, which can actually allow us to benefit from that pretty greatly, because having a 1 mana counterspell, granted it does not counter creatures, but you have things like Tarmogoyf and Tasigur, so you're kind of brickwalling their creatures anyway. So you have this 1 mana counterspell that's just really, really good, and this is like, you know, Spell Pierce on crack, basically. This is potentially one of the best cards if it is just you instant counter target non-creature, I think. So it is definitely worth trying to make happen, especially since, you know, you're playing the color black, so you have a bunch of removal to also keep their creatures in check. And the combination of discard plus counter spells has always been very potent against combo decks, and Modern certainly has a lot of those. And for these various green-black decks, Burn is a pretty problematic matchup. You know, you end up taking a bunch of damage from your lands, and you don't have things that can really affect the board all that quickly, and it's really tough to actually race them, and you can't stop the top of their deck. But recently we've seen a lot of these green-black decks move away from Thoughtseize and play more Inquisitions. So most of my deck lists start with 4 Inquisition these days, and that is mostly because of Burn. And previously, Thoughtseize was really good because you wanted to hit Birthing Pod, you wanted to hit stuff like Scapeshift, maybe Splinter Twin, but Pod is dead. Scapeshift is a deck that basically no one plays, and then against Twin, they're basically not a Twin deck post-board, so you're not super worried about that. Obviously, there are things like Keranos and Batterskull you want to hit, but Inquisition, for the most part, is going to hit like their Deceiver Exarch or their Snapcaster Mage, and like that's what you want. You don't necessarily need this to break up your combo, especially since you have counter spells and removal spells. So I really like Inquisition instead of Thoughtseize because it makes one of the worst parts of your deck, which used to be 3 or 4 Thoughtseize against Burn, into one of the best parts in your deck, which is turn 1 Inquisition, which can take a creature that's, you know, going to deal you 4 to 6 damage over the course of the game, or take their best burn spell like Boros Charm, you know, or if they have a sideboard card like Molten Rain or whatever. Skullcrack is also a very big one, and you actively want hands with multiple Inquisitions instead of, you know, having hands with multiple Thoughtseizes, which are basically just mulligans against them. So I think this deck has a lot of potential. We have some Serum Visions to kind of set up our combo and sculpt our draws and whatnot. We have some Thought Scours to make Tasigur a little easier to cast, and then 5 removal spells, which might be on the low end. And one of the things I don't really like about this deck is that you have to play Dismember, and that might sound kind of funny if you were playing Standard when Dismember came out, where it was just the best card. And that's saying a lot when there was like Stoneforge Mystic and Jace legal, but Dismember really was one of the best cards. And 4 life is a lot, and the reverse of that is a 3-mana removal spell, which is solid but not great. But the fact of the matter is, you need some 1-mana removal spells, and if it means you pay 4 life to do it, you're probably taking less than 4, or you're taking 4 damage, but you're saving more than that over the course of the game, because like their turn 1 Goblin Guide is probably going to deal you 6, for example. So Dismember is good, but I wish we could have something else. Like basically Path to Exile is the card I want, but we can't always be white, you know. But other than that, I think the deck looks pretty good, and like I said, you know, I'm pulling pieces from a bunch of different places. So we have our Training Grounds combo, we have our Stubborn Denial with our big creature combo and whatnot. So maybe this deck will be trying to do too much at once, but you know, we're gonna find out. And as for the mana base, obviously I want multiple black for Pack Rat, multiple blue for Tasigur. So Sunken Ruins is probably the card you think of, where it's like, oh yeah, no matter what, it's no big deal, we got that covered. So I have 1 Sunken Ruins, 1 Urborg. And I think both of those are pretty free to play, but I definitely also want to play Mutavault to make the Pack Rats good, and if you have Mutavault, it makes the Pack Rats ferocious a turn sooner than they normally would be, so that also helps with Stubborn Denial. So I definitely want some Mutavaults, and that means that I can't play a ton of Sunken Ruins like I would want to, and maybe it is just better to play more Sunken Ruins, I don't know, we're going to figure that out, but I feel like the deck wants some number of Mutavaults, so there's a nice little give and take there where you can't afford too many. So I have 24 land and 3 of one of the other, and hopefully that all works out. But Sunken Ruins might be better because it could also facilitate having more Cryptic commands, which I think might end up being pretty good. So most of my decks that looked like this started with 2 Cryptics, and this was a concession to having things like Basic Forest, Mutavault, Overgrown Tomb that might not necessarily be able to cast Cryptic, and in order for Cryptic to be truly great, you really do need to be able to play it on turn 4 if you need to. So maybe the mana is, I think it's good enough to have 1, but once you start wanting to play multiples like 2 or 3, then you really have to warp your mana base around it, and I wanted to try basically everything at once, so that's what I'm doing. Other than that, I like the mana base. I think it looks fine. And then for the sideboard, I think Sultai has a lot of really good options for the modern format, where you have things like Feed the Clan for burn, and obviously those are really good since we have a mini Ferocious theme going on anyway, and 2 mana gain 10 life is about the best you're going to get against them, and if that's the case, it means you have a 4 power guy in place, you probably have a clock, and gain 10 life is almost certainly going to be good enough, so you just have to watch out for Skullcrack. And then we have some Disfigures, which is the 1 mana removal spell I want in certain matchups, but not everyone. So Disfigure against things like Burn, A+. Disfigure against things like Abzan, C-. You know, like if they have things like Noble Hierarch, it gets a little bit better, but it's still not necessarily even worth bringing in there. And you know, obviously there are situations you can sculpt where you jam a 4/5 Goif into their 4/5 Goif or whatever, and you get to Disfigure theirs after combat. But those situations don't come up all that often, so Disfigure has to be relegated to a sideboard slot, I think. Unless the format is really strange, I guess. And then we have another Thoughtseize, which is just an additional discard spell for things like Siege Rhino, and you know, if you run into the occasional Scapeshift or whatever, it's also good against Splinter Twin, regardless of if they're trying to combo you or Keranos you post board. And then I have a Deathmark and a Sower for green decks, and I think both these cards are great. Sower is a little on the slow end. My deck is more lower to the ground, so Sower, while very powerful, I think is good as a one-of, where if I draw one of it over the course of a game, I'm pretty happy, but I don't want my hand getting clogged down with multiples. So we have 1 expensive thing that's good against them, 1 cheap thing that's good against them. And then we have a couple Dispels, which, we're playing Stubborn Denial, so maybe a 4 Stubborn Denial would be better than the Dispels, but I know where I want the Dispels, and Dispel is always going to be good against them, so I don't think I want to take the risk of having a Stubborn Denial but not having a 4-power creature, so Dispels are always going to be great, so I have Dispels instead. That could certainly be wrong. And then a couple Spell Skites for things like Infect and Burn. You could board it in against Scape Shift, but I'm not a huge fan of it there. And then we have a couple Fulminators to kind of round out the sideboard against random decks in Modern, like Amulet and Tron, and even things like Jeskai, where they have Celestial Colonnade, which is very difficult for you to beat when you're an Abrupt Decay deck. So overall, I think this deck looks pretty sweet. Props to Ashok again for a sweet brew, and I'm excited to see how this goes. So let's do it.